You're listening to Were You Still Talking?
They pump out your blood and they pump in a new batch of blood, and all of it is the blood of children.
All the big stars are going to be on TV now. I mean, it's just the way it's going. Your role, I think, will be played by Brad Pitt.
What'd you wear?
I wore my loincloth wrapped around my feet.
Are you going by Jon today?
And that's absolutely true. You feel it in every cell in your body.
Yeah, you can bend the truth and bend the visualizations no matter what your political affiliation.
You could have an alpaca. A girlfriend's daughter recently got married, and they had llamas or alpacas at the wedding.
A recording room. They recorded a couple songs in the kitchen of Rumbo.
So, wait, you microdosed before this, right?
What?
Hey, thanks for tuning in. This is Were You Still Talking? And it is Joel Albrecht talking again. And today in my studio on the Zoom, I have Stephen Hawley Martin. He's a talk show host of a popular weekly internet podcast, The Truth About Life. And it became clear to him when talking on that show and interviewing all types of near-death survivors, psychics, researchers into the paranormal, as well as quantum physicists and medical doctors, that humankind is on the cusp of a transition to a new understanding of the true nature of reality. To share what he's learned and to help speed the transition, which he believes will result in a rebirth of optimism and the world becoming a better place to live and work, he's written more than 24 books, many of which have achieved bestseller status on Amazon. Martin's a former principal of the world-renowned ad firm that created the Geico Gecko, that's a bit of a tongue twister, and Virginia is for Lovers, the Martin Agency, and is currently the editor and publisher of the Oakley Press. He's the only 3-time winner of the Reader's Digest Book Award, having won first prize twice for fiction and once for nonfiction. He's also won first prize for visionary fiction from independent publishers and first prize for nonfiction from U.S. Book News. It's quite the resume. It's really a pretty amazing volume of work. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm very interested to hear your insights on all of this stuff. If anyone listened to the last podcast, this is sort of an entirely different take on things. Last week, the last podcast I did was with not a psychic, but a mentalist who openly pretends to be psychic, but does it through magic tricks, basically. Which is so we're actually talking about the kind of the opposite end of that. People that have had near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, looking at getting to one of the subjects of my podcast, which is going beyond the usual conversation and finding out about things beyond our understanding, perhaps. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, Joel, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So am I. NDEs, perhaps I should explain for people who aren't clear or are not familiar with it. NDE stands for near-death experience. And it doesn't mean, that's not like the faces of death videos you used to see on YouTube. It's not people who almost died. It's people who died according to medical science and came back and have a story to tell about it. There are hundreds of them. There are many people who have best-selling books about it, and there are a lot of different stories you can see about it. So you actually had a podcast where you interviewed a lot of these people and talked about their experiences.
That's correct. Yeah, there are thousands of them now. I think that there's even a website. I don't remember the URL, but that where people can go and read about near-death experiences that people have had. It's because I think that medical science has advanced to the point where we can bring people back from clinical death, and so that's happening more and more. And people are. It used to be kind of a little bit, didn't want to talk about it kind of thing because they were afraid people would think they were crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But now, not so much, and people really are talking about it. I read my first book about it in 1975 or something like that by Raymond Moody, who was a intern at the University of Virginia Medical School and interviewed, I think, over 100 people who had had near-death experiences and wrote all about it then. It was fascinated me, and I read it from cover to cover in one sitting.
Wow. Yeah, that kind of, I've read a few books. I've seen a lot of interviews, and in many cases, I've heard people remark that they think that people are just trying to get attention, where usually the opposite is true. Usually they're very reluctant to tell their story because it does sound out of the normal, far beyond what people are used to, and they come, especially if they're in the medical field, which I've seen more than a few doctors tell their story of experiences with it and experiences with patients who told them stories that they shouldn't have been able to, see, of things they shouldn't have been able to see. And it's always just amazed me.
I think one of the most interesting story like that I know about is a lady her name is Pam Reynolds. In fact, I think there's a YouTube video with Pam Reynolds. Anybody who wants to maybe put Pam Reynolds near-death experience in would probably find it. But she was in a situation where she had two aneurysms, inoperable aneurysms in her brain, in her head. And so they actually had to, the only chance she had, if one of those burst, obviously it would be the end for her.
Mm-hmm.
And so they actually drained the blood from her body. Her heart stopped. She was a cadaver. Of course, they packed ice around her and so forth so that her, body wouldn't deteriorate while they were working on her. Opened up her skull and were able to, with no blood in there, fix those aneurysms. And while that was happening, actually, while she heard the saw, the drill that was cutting open her skull, she popped out of her body. She was able to view what was going on in the operating room. She just was able to describe what the doctors and nurses were saying, and a couple of things that really made it clear that she actually did see this. One of the conversations had to do with a nurse who was trying to get something into that artery that goes down near your groin so that she could drain the blood.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, she described the instrument that the doctor was using, which she said looked like a drill, and she had heard the word saw before, and she thought it was going to be a saw, but it looked more like a drill. So a lot of things that really clearly show that she saw what was going on when she was a cadaver, her body was. Wow. And then she went on through the tunnel that you read about or heard about toward the light. And she was able to visit with her grandmother who had passed away some years before and an uncle who had passed away, and described all that. Really fascinating information. And then finally her uncle told her that she had to go back. She said she didn't want to go back. She liked it there. It was such a loving place. She was feeling great. But the uncle took her down the tunnel, and she could see her body on the operating table, and it was a cadaver. And she said she really didn't want to get back in that. But of course, what they did is they put the blood back in her body. They had some way of warming up her body again, and then of course they used those electro things and did the spark, and she was back in her body. So fascinating story, but one, if you were going to do an experiment to see what happened when you're dead, that would have been it, because she was dead.
Yeah, those things always amaze me, and seems like pretty clear evidence, since it's she tells her story to doctors and people of the medical community, but it's still very I don't know, it's still very kind of shoved under the rug and things like that.
Well, doctors want to fight death. They don't want to that's the. I guess they went into that profession so that they could prevent death, and so the idea that maybe death isn't such a bad thing. But I think the real reason is that most scientists, or at least until recently, are scientific materialists. It's a 19th century idea that actually it goes back further. If you want to know the history of it, I have researched all that. The idea that nothing exists except material substance. If you can't see it under a microscope, it doesn't exist, is the idea. And a lot of science, at least official science, sticks to that now. It's their story and they're sticking to it.
Right.
There's so much evidence to the contrary nowadays. It's absolutely amazing. The University of Virginia Medical School, for example, has been studying this for 60 years, since 1960, 61 years now. And they have come out and said that the brain does not create consciousness. The brain is a receiver of consciousness that integrates it with your body, but actually consciousness originates someplace else. And that's what they say. And they've got different reasons that we could talk about that they believe that.
Mm-hmm. So that's almost, that's not irrefutable evidence of life after death, but it's pretty good evidence. I mean, they're close, if not, at least one university convinced that consciousness has not really come from the brain, which has been the common medical idea for, forever.
Well, really not forever, but it has been has been for the last 150, 160 years. Before that, people back in the 18th century and before, people thought that that consciousness and the body were separate. That we have ghosts when we die and so forth. And but the University of Virginia Medical School, a guy named Ian Stephen was the one who began that research, and he started researching children's memories of past lives, and he began doing that in 1960. Back then, most of the cases were in countries where people believe in reincarnation, like India and Burma and places like that. But nowadays, I'm told, I've interviewed the researcher who took over his place at the university a couple of times, and he says they have no trouble at all finding cases like that nowadays, because they have a website, and when parents start having children talk about past lives, they could do a Google search and they'll find them, and they'll get onto them right away. But they have, in those 60 years, they've collected something like 2,700 cases of children who remember past lives, and they've researched them to see whether there was really an individual that the child indicates he or she was, and well over half of them, I think like 1,600 of them, they've been able to check out as verified that indeed there was someone who fit that description, who had that, different things that the child talked about, that kind of life.
That's amazing. That's really incredible. I've always wondered about past lives. The theory that I kind of subscribe to is that we live a lot of different realities all at once, but it's kind of beyond our understanding to get to that.
I think when we do, in fact, live a couple of realities at once. I think when you go to sleep at night, you go into another reality and may communicate with people that not only that are alive today, but that are on the other side. So who knows? Oh
yeah, that makes sense. And I often see people who've passed in our dreams, and dreams definitely seem like a different reality, but they're real. It's it's either our consciousness working out, or subconscious working out problems, or we're literally going into a different realm while we're resting in this in this realm and experiencing different things to continue to grow. You actually come from a background that's mostly science, isn't that right? Where that you grew up as a materialist?
I grew up in a family of materialists that believed that there was, if you couldn't see it under a microscope, it didn't exist. And,
right.
And that was my background. And so I was I don't know if you would call me an atheist. I was an agnostic. I didn't know. I didn't think you could know if any of this kind of thing was real. But then I had an out of body experience when I was 25 years old. I had the flu, and I was really sick. But I lived in an apartment with two other guys. I was working at an ad agency in Baltimore, Maryland, and I heard these people come into the apartment. And there was suddenly a party going on, and it was a Saturday night. So I went downstairs and I had a couple of drinks, and then there were some people smoking a funny cigarette, and I had a little bit of that. And then I went, and I started to feel horrible, and I kind of knee walked all the way back up to my bedroom on the second floor, and flopped onto the bed, and it was spinning like a helicopter's blade, taking off. And then suddenly everything was calm. And I looked down. I don't know why I looked down. Looked up first, and I saw the ceiling. And I looked down, and I saw my body lying on the bed, passed out. And I thought, and I was it was very calm. And, I felt okay. When I just a minute ago had felt horrible. And I thought, this can't be, because my brain creates consciousness. But I'm up here conscious of my body down there, and my brain's down there within my body. So this can't be. And then kind of the next thing that happened was I woke up the next morning and I felt a whole lot better. But that really started me on this journey of trying to figure out how that could be possible and what the true nature of reality is. And I joined the Rosicrucian Society, and I can tell you, they know a lot of stuff. That's an ancient society that Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and a lot of our founding fathers were part of. And they all believed in reincarnation because it's one of the teachings of the Rosicrucians. So that kind of tells you how I got started on it.
And when you were floating above your body and looking down, it was not. It was obvious that was a real experience, right? It didn't feel like a dream. It didn't feel like you were hallucinating. Wasn't the funny cigarettes.
And I'd had the funny cigarettes before, and I had some after. It's not the same thing at all.
Right.
It was real. I was looking down, and there I am, on the bed. Oh my gosh, how can this be? And it was, as they say sometimes about the near death, it was as real or more real than real reality. It was like clear as day. And,
yes, I've heard a lot of the near-death experiencers say that it actually seems more real than life, than our life now.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. Life now seems pretty real if you get hurt.
Yeah.
Once you break an arm or something, it suddenly seems more real. But but what is this society? I haven't heard of that. This sounds really interesting.
The Rosicrucian Society?
The Rosicrucians, yeah.
Yeah, you could Google that.
Okay.
They're headquartered in California, I think, San Jose. But they've been around they say they've been around forever and ever and ever, but they have been around for at least 200 or 300 years. And
wow.
It's, esoteric kind of teachings, has to do with what reality is, which they would say is vibrations, which is true.
Mm-hmm.
And that we reincarnate, that reincarnation is the thing, that the average lifespan is something. I probably shouldn't be telling you all this because it's a secret society, but I haven't been involved with them probably in 25 years now.
Oh, that's okay. No one listens to this.
Yeah, but they say that the average lifespan is 140 years. So if you live for 70 years, you're going to spend 70 years before you incarnate again.
Oh, interesting.
Now that would be on average, because the University of Virginia, those kids that come back, or they're not kids when they left, but when they start talking about their previous lives, usually it starts around when they're 2 years old and continues until they're about 6 years old. A lot of them come back as quickly as 15 months from the time that they died. And some of them, they're outliers. There's a famous case of a child who apparently was a fighter pilot in World War II who was shot down at Iwo Jima. Name was James Lettinger. And he was reborn in 1999, I believe. So that had been, 60 years or so. But many of those cases of the University of Virginia cases they were traumatic deaths. And so it may be that they didn't go through the normal, whatever it is you go through between lives. They kind of came back faster because of unfinished business, or they felt like their life got cut short, and so they want to come back again pretty quick. Many of them were murdered. Some of them were killed in wars, that sort of accidents, that sort of thing. Unnatural deaths, I guess you would call it.
Right. And at what point did science decide that there was not really a spiritual side to medicine? It was all entirely materialistic, like you said, 150 years ago.
Well, I say that because that's when Darwin published his On the Origin of Species in 1859. Mm-hmm. But it really started before that. There was a philosopher in the, 17th century, 1600s, named Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes is an Englishman who made a statement that got picked up by intellectuals, later turned into the Age of Enlightenment, or the, although people believe this. And his statement was that God created the world, the universe, and if God created it, then that's all there is. There can't be anything else. And he was really railing against the idea back then of witchcraft and ghosts and all kinds of supernatural stuff that people believed in back in those days, particularly with this witch trials and all of that, people cavorting with Satan, and he just wanted to put an end to that. He said, the only thing that exists is material reality. He didn't put it in those words, but that's what it meant. And people latched onto that. And so intellectuals in the 18th century, he was 17th century, in the 18th century, like Thomas Jefferson and others, that's what they believed. They believed in what is come to be known as the great clockmaker theory, where God created the universe, kind of wound it up and let it go. And it's no longer involved in it and all that. All it is a kind of like a great big pool game, or, the balls and things spinning around each other. And then, along came Darwin in the 19th century, who said that he explained how we have life and how it's all everything came from a common origin, but it's evolved into these different branches on the tree. And so, that took God out of it completely. And that really is what most scientists still, hang on to today. Now, one of my books, I talk about, I think, Darwin was probably right about survival of the fittest being a mechanism of how things go from maybe one environment to another, so how organisms adapt. But think, for example, of the guys who discovered DNA back in 1953. The DNA molecule, as everybody knows, is a helix kind of shape. And if you took all that and stretched it out, it would be over 6 feet long inside that tiny one molecule. Now, very, very skinny, but 6 feet long. Mm-hmm. And yet all of that is like computer code that tells the body how to make proteins and when to make them and so on and so forth. So how could something 6 feet of computer code that's microscopic happen by accident? And then how could something like from a one-celled animal to us with eyes, ears, kidneys, livers, so forth, how does a heart or a liver develop by accident? How does that make survival of the fittest? In other words, there are all kinds of holes in the Darwinian theory, basically because of the complexity that we now understand that they didn't understand back in the 19th century that exists. That would, mathematicians have done the statistical analysis on those sort of things happening, and there's not enough time from the time that the Earth formed until life came about for that to have happened. Statistically, it's impossible. So, what is it? My theory is that consciousness is primary, is the ground of reality. And this really goes with what the Hindu rishis figured out 4,000 years ago. They called it Verda. Uh-huh. But really, when you boil down Verda and see what they're talking about, it's really consciousness. And there are quantum physicists that I've researched, that I've talked to, who talk about the unified field being the ground of reality, what everything comes from, the Big Bang. But when you boil it down, it's really the same thing as Verda or consciousness. I mean, that's what it is. And all of us are conscious, just as plants and animals and everything else is conscious. We happen to be self-aware. But my theory then is that we all share the same consciousness. And I'm not the only person who thinks this, but we think we're different because we've got all our memories and we've got our ego that's developed over a period of time, and even our subconscious mind has memories of past lives. People would call that the soul, but it's all of that makes us feel like we're different. But if we really think about the silent observer at the back of our mind that can kind of observe our own thoughts, that is what I'm talking about being the consciousness that we all share.
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, yeah, I'm one of these people that believe that we're all connected. It's hard to kind of imagine that as human beings because our ego does a really good job of fooling us to thinking Absolutely. We're not connected and that other people are different, and so we should be angry at them and stuff. And that also comes from a survival instinct, as far as I know. That I've been reading different books about how the origins of man and things. We survived for a long time by telling large groups of people that other group is not as good, so we should take over that territory and eat those plants and animals or whatever it was. So it's been it was a long time that our survival might have depended on having these opinions that we're not connected. But I definitely believe that everything is connected. There is an amazing documentary that came out recently. I believe it's on Netflix about fungi. And how it is literally connected all over the world. They're now finding that these plants underground are connected to each other for thousands of miles, and they communicate. They communicate between each other all over the earth, and it's pretty impressive which is just kind of another illustration of how things are connected, you know, and how everything can be connected. And it is. We just don't have a clear understanding of it yet.
Yeah, I would go so far as to say there really is only one life, and we're all part of that one life. And you're absolutely correct, I believe, when you say that the ego is a product of evolution. As we were evolving, we needed to think of ourselves at first, and more important than everything else, or we wouldn't survive. You know, that's it.
Yeah.
And, you know, if the bad guys came along, we had to fight them. And, you know, everything you said about our territorial instincts of, you know, this is my land and those are my cows over there kind of thing. But you also see when there are disasters where people will, you know, run into a burning house to save somebody they don't even know. And that to me is getting down to what's really all about. We're all one. We just don't realize it because our egos won't let us. And but sometimes that ego goes away when a situation gets like that. And, you know, people will do miraculous things to save others.
Yeah, you actually see that in a lot of big disasters where, you know, in the movies, a disaster happens and there's lots of looting and there's lots of, you know, nasty stuff. But in the real world, when those things happen, most people jump on, you know, how do I help everyone? How do I get my neighbor out of there? Or how do I get my neighbor's neighbor, you know, out of this disaster zone and get help to them? So that kind of shows how our connected instincts will just kind of kick in, I think, in those circumstances. They kind of jump right in. So another question I had about reincarnation is if that exists, and I believe it definitely is possible, why? Why do we reincarnate? I mean, what's your theory on that?
My theory on why we reincarnate is really that it is part of evolution, that the whole I think that life itself has, and I use this in one of my novels that I wrote, that the secret of life is the urge to become. We're always trying to be more and better and to grow, most of us. You know, there are people get depressed and don't do that, but I'm talking about normally. And that really the purpose of life is to evolve, and we can get into, you know, where evolving to what. But so the reason you come back, well, there can be a number of reasons. I mean, the Buddhists say you come back because you miss worldly pleasures, you know, sex and food and things like that you can't have as a spirit. But typically, I think people come back either because they have something they want to accomplish, a mission, or they have some things that they want to learn, that they're trying to develop themselves, to develop their souls, you know, to perfect their souls. I'll give you an example. You know, what I'm talking about here, when you're trying to overcome karma. Are you you're familiar with the word karma?
I'm familiar with the word karma. Yeah, that's been around. I've learned about that when I was in probably junior high or something.
Yeah, you know,
yeah.
You do something bad and something bad comes back at you. You know, that's the cause and effect part of it. But there's really more to it than that. You ever seen the movie Groundhog Day?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Great movie. I think Groundhog Day, that movie, is a metaphor, or what's the other word, a allegory of what life is about in reincarnation. If you haven't seen it, for some of your listeners, Bill Murray is this character in this movie who, when it starts out, he is a real cynic, and he's just kind of a jerk. And things happen to him, and he just, you know, lashes out like a jerk, or a cynic would, and makes a mess out of things, and goes through the whole day doing that. And then when he goes to sleep at night, the next morning, he wakes up and it's Groundhog Day again, the same day. And the same things happen to him. And all that goes on for an hour and a half until finally at the end of the last time that February 2, Groundhog's Day, comes around again, he has changed, and instead of acting like a jerk and a cynic, he does the right thing. He treats people with love, with respect and love, and he saves somebody who's choking, and he is nice to the guy who's trying to sell him insurance and things like that. But after he goes through that day, he goes to bed. He wins the girl. He gets the girl who thinks he's a jerk in the beginning, now thinks he's a great guy and likes him. He goes to bed that night and wakes up the next morning. It's February 3rd. Well, to me, that's an allegory about what reincarnation is about. You keep coming back till you get it right, till you learn from the mistakes you made and the things that come at you because of the mistakes you made, until you learn how to deal with them. And then you grow, your spirit grows, your soul grows, if you want to use that word, and you're able to move on. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Or maybe you just miss coffee.
Yeah, maybe he did. Maybe he did just miss. He certainly did that first day because he was sure a jerk.
Well, that's why I would come back. More coffee.
Yeah.
No, but that totally makes sense to me, because it even happens within our life. We go through phases of life, and hopefully we're learning more stuff. And a lot of times when we get through a really difficult part, down the line, we can look back and realize that we learned something from that. Or maybe, maybe we don't learn and we end up doing that same thing over again.
Yeah, well, one of the, have you ever heard of Edgar Casey? Edgar Casey was probably the most famous psychic that lived in the 20th century. He was born in 1877, I believe, and died in 1945. He was called the Sleeping Prophet. There were all kinds of headlines about him because he would, be able to tell things that nobody could possibly know because he was psychic. He actually put himself into a trance every morning and every afternoon, and people would write in and have questions. Many of them had to do with physical issues, health problems where the doctors hadn't been able to help them, and so they'd ask Edgar Casey about it, and he'd give them a cure, give them how to get rid of it. But a lot of them had to do with otherworldly and psychic things, and he talked, and he past lives often had to do with people's problems in today's life. Something that was a hangover from something in a past life. Phobia they might have, for example. And he said that karma was really kind of more like a memory, and that an example he gave was, take someone who seems to always attract the wrong kind of person to them, that treats them badly, that abuses them, that is disrespectful to them. And that person always seems to have that happen to them. Now, why does that happen? It probably happens because whoever it is has a low opinion of themselves and attracts people who share their low opinion of that person. And so the way for that person to overcome that is to realize that they are a human being. They're a soul, they're a spiritual being inhabiting a physical body right now, and that they're very special, and they shouldn't, they don't have to put up with that. Once they get that through their heads, they're going to stop attracting the wrong kind of person to them. One of the metaphysical laws, and I believe this is absolutely true, and it's certainly what the Rosicrucians say, and that is that like attracts like. You're going to attract people to you who are very much like yourself. And so in this case, karma is not a punishment of that person who, it is a punishment in the sense that they don't like being abused, but it's a teaching mechanism for them to learn what they need to do about themselves. And so you could really look at life as there's no such thing as bad things happen. It's only opportunities to learn from. And even, when you get sick or you have something terrible happen, like you were saying, when you go through it at the end, after some time, you can look back and think, wow, that was really a period of growth for me. It opened my eyes about certain things. So
right. That you hope.
As you said, not always, and then probably the same problem's going to happen again. I think one of the reasons that people do get sick is because they're on the wrong path in some way, and it's kind of it should be a red flag that goes up and say, hey, you need to do something to change because you're not headed in the right direction, and the universe is giving you a signal here.
Right. That's a very good. Makes sense to me. Absolutely makes sense to me. And I also was curious. You're interested in UFOs, and you have some thoughts about UFOs. It seems there's more every day, literally every day. There's another news story about the government having to release evidence of UFOs. So this is really interesting. It seems like we're getting closer and closer to learning a lot more about whether or not other life is visiting this Earth.
Yeah. I read somewhere recently that the NSA, is it the NSA or is it NASA? Somebody from the government is going to release a report on UFOs. I think it said by June 1. And the guy that was quoted in the article was the head of the intelligence agencies, all the intelligence agencies under Trump. I can't think of his name. But anyway, so we're going to get some more information. But I'll tell you, my first job out of college, my boss had been a colonel in the Air Force. He was a retired colonel, and he had been a pilot. And he told me one evening, we're having some drinks or something, that he was flying this big transport plane over the Atlantic. And he had a crew, I think, of 4 or 5 other guys on the plane. And this UFO, this bright light, came up and flew alongside him right off to his right for half an hour.
Wow.
All of the crew saw it.
Uh-huh.
And then at some point it just shot off to the right in a way that, would be physically impossible with the kind of airplanes and machinery we had. That he filed a report and never heard any more about it. So that started me thinking, well, they must exist. I mean, this guy had no reason to tell that story to me, except that, it happened. And I think that what they are people or whatever from civilizations that are more advanced than we are. And I don't think that they're going to land on the White House lawn and say, take me to see Joe Biden. I think they're not going to really interface with us until they feel we're ready. Because I think one of the most important things about us and about being a sentient being is having free will. And they're not going to interfere with that. But when we ask them and when we're ready, I think then we will have contact. And hopefully, I hope that happens in my lifetime, because I'm really interested to know how in the world they're able to, how those machines work that they're
how could they possibly be getting here? Even our science now seems to be getting closer and closer to some answers about how it might be possible. I just read recently that the idea of a warp drive, if you're not a Trekkie, then you maybe don't understand what warp drive is. But warp drives actually warp space. And the way they do the effects on Star Trek doesn't make sense because they just make the stars blurry. But what you're really doing is kind of folding space and jumping through space because you're warping the space you're in. But
it's
now
like it's like you had something way over here, something way over here, and you kind of bend them together.
And you kind right.
And then you get there. And I think it could be something like that. I also think that there are other dimensions, and that somehow they may go through those. I don't know. I mean, they talk about how particle entanglement in quantum physics, where two particles separate and they can be as far apart as the other side of the universe, and one changes, the other will change with it. So, I mean, that's a fact.
Right.
So there's something going on there like that.
But I totally agree that it's very possible that they are not going to. I actually think a big reason for not contacting or not openly contacting the people of Earth is that because I think they've contacted people. I think they've made, I think there are people who probably have been in contact with extraterrestrials. But the biggest thing is that we're maybe not far enough along our path as far as what we believe in, and as far as how much that would just, really scare people. There's so many people and societies who would be devastated to find out that we're not the only ones, because of their beliefs, basically.
I guess you're right. I hadn't thought about that part. I mean, the church got all bent out of shape when Galileo said the sun was at the center of the solar system.
Right.
Instead of the Earth. Instead of everything revolving around the Earth, the Earth was revolving around the sun, and that really got them upset. But you're right. Talking about extraterrestrial life contacting us, are you familiar with Ra and the Law of One?
No. What is that about?
That's kind of it's surprising because I actually heard about this when it came out. And it's come back. I mean, you could find it on the internet. In fact, I've written a little short book about it. Ra was supposedly a extraterrestrial who is not just one being, but a whole civilization that has combined into one being. Apparently. And Ra says that's what happens as we go along in evolution. And a group of people, 3 individuals, channeled Ra starting in 1980 and over a couple of years, 1981, 82, 83, something like that. There are 5 books that are about Ra and the Law of One. And Ra, supposedly, according to Ra, was a civilization that existed on Venus a couple of billion years ago. Now people say, laugh, Venus can't support life. Well, that's true, it can't right now, but NASA has come out and said that it could have, and this is recent, in the last 6 months, has come out and said that Venus would have been hospitable to life a couple of billion years ago, that it had liquid water, on the planet and all that, and the right temperatures and so forth. So anyway, Ra is supposed to have evolved on Venus and now exists in a non-physical dimension, and came through these folks, channeled in the early 1980s, and gave all this information about how we are evolving, and in 2012 we would pass from being a 3rd density world to the beginning of a 4th density world. And 3rd density world is, let's say what the first 3 densities are. The first density is just mineral. It would be like a planet with no water, no life. Second density world would be one with plants and animals. A 3rd density world would be plants and animals and beings that are self-aware, which is us. We can step outside ourselves and think about ourselves and where we're going and what we did and what might happen, like we're doing now.
Right.
A 4th density world would be where we realize that we're all one, that there's one life, and that we're, if you harm your neighbor, you're harming yourself, kind of thing. What did Jesus say? Whatever you've done to these, the least of my brothers, you've done to me, something like that. And then a fifth density world is where we really get the technology going. And the sixth density world is where we get the oneness and the technology together. And then the seventh density world is where we begin to return to the source and start all over again. So that's kind of Ra in a nutshell, or the law of one in a nutshell. But what prompted me in saying that was the idea that some people have been in touch with these alien civilizations.
Mm-hmm. And that makes a lot of sense to me too, is that there are other dimensions that we don't understand. There was recently a movie with Matthew McConaughey, I think it's about 2 years old now, where he goes out into space and then he gets kind of caught in between dimensions. And so he's watching his daughter in her room like a year before he left. And it's very twisted, but it was interesting because they were putting together the whole multiple dimensions of space idea, and they were trying to explain it, visually and in a movie. It was pretty wild. I can't remember what the movie's called now, but that's always fascinated me, that there can be, there can be other dimensions that we want, and even I think scientists and physicists have talked about this.
Oh yeah, physicists talk about it. I mean that. I heard one of them was saying that he calculated there are 23 dimensions, but who knows?
Interesting.
I don't know.
Interesting.
Well, but Ra would tell us that our universe, our physical universe, is just a very small part of the whole thing.
Right, and that's really interesting. And we kind of talked about this on my last podcast, where we were actually using a deck of cards to illustrate how people's minds can't understand big numbers. Like we don't even understand how many combinations could be made out of 52 because it's so big. And it's the same thing with our universe. It's hard for us to understand the immensity of our universe. So it's got to be it's really difficult to conceive that there's more than one.
Yeah.
Just one. And in a way, it's easy to conceive when you look at these cool YouTube videos that start in outer space and slowly pan into Earth. And first Earth is just a blip, like you can't even see it. It's just the head of a pin, and you slowly pan in, and they come all the way down to somebody's room. It's amazing.
And our universe is so huge. I mean, and that's one of the things, people say, well, established science. Well, there really isn't such a thing as established science at this point, at least. I mean, people thought that first of all, people thought the Earth was flat for a long time, right? And then along comes Columbus or that other guy who circumnavigated the globe. And then people thought the Earth was the center of the universe, and then comes Galileo, and he blows a hole in that. And then along in 1920-something was Hubble, who, up until then, we thought that the Milky Way was it. And then he figures out that Milky Way is just one galaxy of millions, billions of galaxies. And he figures out this whole red shift thing, that everything is moving away from each other. Well, nobody knew that before 1920.
Yeah, so, I didn't even realize it was that recent. That's
amazing. Like maybe 100 years ago, but it seems to me like it's just practically yesterday.
That's not long ago. There are people older than that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, my mother would have, when she was growing up, thought the Milky Way was it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and now we've come full circle, and there are people who think the Earth is flat again. But
they haven't seen those pictures that you were talking about.
It's true. It's hard to imagine. It's another example, I think, of our minds having a hard time with big things. It's like, well, it's easier to think that the Earth is flat and there's really, or there's nothing out there, or it's an easier picture. It's kind of like the people who say the moon landing never happened.
Right.
But for me, when I look at a picture of the moon, or I look at any picture taken from space, that's not Earth. I just instantly say, that is not where I live. That's amazing. It just blows my mind.
Yeah, all these pictures coming back from Mars and all. Gosh.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. It's really amazing. Oh, and the other side of that is we were talking about extraterrestrials. In all the sci-fi movies, they're certainly smart enough to cloak themselves. So, why couldn't there be people living on Mars now? And they make this imaginary planet that looks like nothing could live there. We can visit. They know where we're going to come visit, so they'll.
Yeah,
that's what I've always thought about. Well, why couldn't they just be hiding? Mars is big. It's a big planet.
Right. Wow.
Just a thought.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, this is all. It's all just amazing, and it's hard to. Science is pretty advanced compared to what it was 100 years ago. So that's why it's hard to think about how there's so much more that could be discovered. It's like we do know now how to study DNA actually in order to make antidote for a virus in a year,
or even edit it, even do some little, moving some things around to cure problems and so forth.
Right, and we're very close to being able to probably cure diseases with, DNA. Yeah, and
that was just discovered in 1953. When DNA was forgotten. What was the guy's name? Plick and somebody. I don't know. But anyway, it hadn't been that long ago.
Right. It's new. It's really new. It's a very new science, and it's mind-boggling. And so it is hard to because science is so advanced. Sometimes it's hard to realize that it still could. There could be just there's new discoveries every day. There's There's ship captains discovering that the Suez Canal is not that big. That's an unfortunate discovery.
That's right.
Everyone's like, what's the Suez Canal? What is that?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, we've been talking a while. I could talk to you a lot longer, but I know I don't want to keep you here all night. This is it's really an interesting conversation, and you have 20 books that people can read about it. What's the best place for them to find? Do you have a website that connects everything?
I do. My website's a very easy one to remember. It's S.H. Martin, all run together, Stephen Hawley Martin, shmartin.com, shmartin.com. Go to that, and you'll see at the top, there'll be a menu, and there's one little button that says books. Click on that, and you'll see all those books. And if you want to find out more about any one of them, you can just click on the cover image, and it'll take you it'll open a new page that tells you all about that book. So yeah, and you could probably read, the first chapter or so of it, maybe even a little more. And so shmartin.com.
All right, that's good. That's an easy one. So many people make it difficult.
Right.
All right. Well, we're going to wrap this up today. You've been listening to Were You Still Talking? This is Joel Albrecht, and I have been speaking to Stephen Hawley Martin, who is an amazing scientist, truth seeker, has good new and different ideas about all kinds of things. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did, maybe you could give it a star, give it a rating. I don't know. I don't care that much. We're all the same. What difference does it make? So, thanks again for listening. And as I always say, be good to yourself and be good to each other, especially since we are all the same.